want you to watch this episode unless you've just watched that episode about reading a passage. Because in this episode, we're going to talk about question types. And we're going to look at the questions that go with the passage we just read and see how our great reading of the passage will help us answer the questions. In this episode, we'll talk about the 6 question types that you'll see on the ACT. We'll talk about common wrong answer traps and how not to fall for them. And we'll look at examples from the passage in the previous episode. There are 6 question types you'll see on the ACT, and I'll go into every single one of them, and we'll look at examples so you'll know what to expect. But before I get started, let me tell you why it's so important to know about the 6 question types. 3 really good reasons. First of all, you'll just feel much more comfortable. It's a really good feeling to know how predictable the ACT is. We've talked about that a lot. You already know you've got your 4 predictable passages. You know what order they're going to come in. You know generally what the topic is going to be for each one. It's also a great feeling to know there are only 6 question types you'll ever see on the reading section, and they'll repeat consistently. So we'll go through them so you'll know what you're going to see. The next reason it's good to know about the question types is that you'll know what to look for in the passages. If you know exactly what the questions are going to be asking, you'll know what to look for when you read. And we did talk about that in the previous episode, but this is just going to reinforce that. Last, pacing. Knowing the question types is really good for pacing. After enough practice tests, you'll have a sense of what question types are more your thing and which ones aren't. So if you get to a question and you know it's a type that takes you a really long time, you're having trouble figuring it out, you might want to just guess and keep going. But that's why it's great to know what question types are which. Detail questions is the first one. These are my favorites. They are the easiest to answer and comprise nearly a third of the reading section. These are the ones that you can spot really easily, and they're just asking about details straight from the passage. No mental gymnastics here. No thinking, is it this? Is it that? This is going to be straight in the passage. And the words will let you know that it's straight in the passage. The wording will be something like, the passage states, or according to the passage. Really clear wording to show you that it's straight in the passage, and you don't have to do a lot of thinking about it. Let's look at an example. The passage states that historically, marriage was largely what? And then we've got 4 choices. Now we're not actually going to go through this now. We'll do all the questions together at the end, kind of like how you'd see it on a real reading passage, but I just want to look at the wording here. So the passage states, easy, straight from the passage, detailed question, and how cool is it that a third of the questions are this straightforward on the reading section. Next, inference questions. These are a little trickier. This is the second most common question type. And these are the ones that require you to read between the lines. Remember, we talked about reading the passage and we talked about I wonder statements. Like, why would the author be telling me that? Why is that example there? These are the questions that test your knowledge of kind of what happened between the lines when you were reading. The wording will be things like, the author implies that, or you can infer from the passage that blah, 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 or the passage suggests. You see how that wording also very clear, and it's not straight in the passage. It's something that is almost straight in the passage and maybe a slight logical step. You don't want any logical leaps here. There's still only one right answer choice. It's not like it's an opinion. Let's look at an example. Professor Trevelyan's phrase, so far at least as law and custom could make him, implies that. So what's being implied by this line that comes up here? And again, the language makes it really easy to know. It's an inference question. When you see this on the ACT, hopefully you'll think, I know it's a little more technical and a little more complicated than a detailed question. I have to think a little more and I have to read between the lines to answer a question like this. Next question type, main idea. Remember we talked about sweep 1, pulling the main idea out of the passage, and we marked it up in sweep 2. This is where that comes in handy. Main idea questions ask about the broader concepts in the passage, things like the overall purpose, the author's main idea, and then again, you'll know from the language what it's testing. Here's an example. This passage is primarily concerned with what? So to answer these questions, think big picture, never get bogged down in details. Okay, next question type, structure questions. These ask about the structure of the passage, and they focus on the author's argument. Think like the author to answer these questions. These are questions like, why is this word here? Why is this example here? Why is this paragraph here? How does this bolster the author's point? Here's an example. Phaedra, Cressida, and Rosalind are cited as examples of women portrayed by famous what? So here, why did the author use these examples? So think like an author. Author's view questions. This is the next question type. They ask about the author's attitude or tone in the passage. Remember, we looked at these when we looked through the passage. We looked for things like, what's the author feeling about this? Is the author really invested? What's the tone here? This is where that's going to be tested. And you'll know too from the wording, the author's feelings about the results of her research would most likely be described as what? So we kept an eye out for this as we read, and this is where that's going to be rewarded. They're asking, how did the author feel about that? Last question type. Don't worry about these if you're not crazy about them because they only show up once. Word and context questions. These are easy to spot, usually only one, and the most common definition of the word will always be in the answer choices, and it's always wrong. These are the ones that highlight a word from the passage, and they'll ask you, what does it mean in context there? So for example, as it is used in line 18 of the passage we read, the word wanting most nearly means what? They pick up a word out of context, and they ask you, what does it mean in the context of the passage? Easy to spot, only shows up once. So in a nutshell, those are the 6 question types that you're going to see on the ACT. So now let's talk about the common wrong answer traps that you'll see on the ACT. First, misuse detail. Students fall for this all the time. It's really tricky. Misuse detail means they'll take a really prominent detail from the passage and stick it in as an answer choice, and you'll see it and you'll think, yes, I recognize that. I've seen it. It must be right. It's actually usually wrong. If something's straight from the passage and you really remember it, make sure it's answering the right question. So the question might be asking something different, and then you've got this detail and you want to jump on it, but make sure it's the right answer to your question. We'll look at some examples and I'll point them out. Too out there is the next one. Some of them are just ridiculous. Maybe they'll have a teeny thing that you'll recognize from the passage and the rest of it is just out there. Keep an eye out for those. Extreme is the next type. If anything's ever too extreme, it's wrong. On the ACT, people usually aren't furious, they're just unhappy. If you see words like never, always, be really wary of picking those answer choices. And sometimes you'll have answers that are correct, but just taken to the extreme. In the passage, maybe someone will be a little upset, and the answer choice will be something like infuriated. Don't fall for those. Last, half right, half wrong. Really, really tricky. These answers are what they sound like. Half right, half wrong. You'll look at it, you'll want to pick it because it's almost right, and then there'll be a slight twist at the end, and it'll be wrong. So keep an eye out for those. Okay, those are the common wrong answer traps that you're going to see on the ACT. So now that we've talked about the common question types you'll see and common pitfalls, let's try some real practice questions based on the passage that we read earlier. If you'll remember, the passage was about women's roles. It was by Virginia Woolf. And if you don't remember, go back to that episode and check it out. Let's look at the questions about it. First question, this passage is primarily concerned with what? Let me tell you something before we actually look at answering this question. A good strategy that works for me and that works for a lot of students is to actually think about what the answer is going to be before you head to the answer choices. The reason this works is because then you have an idea of what you're looking for, and then you won't fall for some of the traps. I tell students it's kind of like shopping. You walk into a grocery store, you don't have a list. You'll probably come out with, the whipped cream that was on sale, that stuff at the counters that you didn't really want. And did you pick up your eggs that you needed? Maybe not. But you walk in, you've got your list, you need your eggs, you pick up your eggs, you leave. You're great. Same thing here. Let's have an idea of what we're looking for. We say predict before you peek, right? So think what you're going to look for, and then we'll shop through the answer choices. Okay, so we've got our question here. It's a main idea question. Passage is primarily concerned. Well, we talked about this. What was the passage primarily concerned with? The role of women in England, right? And about how they look great in all the literature, really powerful women, but in real life they were beaten, they were abused, so it was really different than how they appeared in written works. Okay, which answer choice most sounds like that? So we predicted before we're going to look. We've got A, the absence of women in literature as authors compared to their prominence as characters. Think about that for a second. That's kind of like what we just said, right? The passage was primarily concerned with how women were absent from literature, but they were really prominent as characters. So the absence of women in literature as authors. Sorry, they weren't really writing anything, but in literature they were prominent as characters. Let's just check the other answer choices just to make sure. B, the factual accuracy of accounts of women in 20th century history books. This is really tricky. It's kind of misused detail, kind of half right, half wrong, right? Because you might jump on it. 20th century history books. I know we read about history books, historians, there was a lot of historical stuff, and a lot of stuff about women, but read carefully. The factual accuracy of accounts of women in 20th century books. This is saying how correct were the accounts of women in the books? And that's not what she was talking about, right? She was talking about how women actually lived versus how they were portrayed, and how they were portrayed in literature, not how they appeared in history books. Okay, we can cross off B. What about C? The moral standing of characters such as Lady Macbeth and Becky Sharp. Also, misused detail. You might see these characters, you think, oh, I saw that. Maybe that's the right answer. Nope, moral standing. That's totally out there. That didn't come in at all. We can cross that off. D, an autobiographical account of commercial failure as a female writer. This is a totally out there answer choice, right? Nothing here was about commercial anything. So this is definitely wrong. And we know the answer choice has to be A. Great. Let's go to the next one. Number 2, the metaphor of a spider's web is used to indicate that what? Okay, and if you remember when we read this, I said, let's mark it as an example. We might not even need it. Here, it looks like they actually want us to answer, what was up with that spider's web? So let's take a look at the passage. Because we marked it, we know where it is. It's in paragraph 2. And let's just skim quickly and see if we can get the gist. Let's find it. Fiction is like a spider's web, attached ever so lightly perhaps, but still attached to life. At all four corners, often the attachment is scarcely perceptible. Shakespeare's plays, for instance, seem to hang out there complete by themselves, but when the web is pulled askew, hooked up at the edge, torn in the middle, one remembers that these webs are not spun in mid-air by incorporeal creatures, but are the work of suffering human beings and are attached to grossly material things like health and money and the houses we live in. So think about this for a second. What's the gist here? Fiction is like a web attached ever so lightly to life. And then she says, remember, this fictional stuff, you think it's just standing there by itself, but it's not. It's the work of suffering human beings, and it's, has to do with their lives, attached to grossly material things like health and like money and the houses that we live in. So to go back to question 2, if you were to predict before you peek, here, what was the whole spiderweb talking about? Kind of about how fiction, when you think about it, does have connection to real life and the lives of the authors. Even though you might not think so, it's just somewhat connected to what's going on in the real world. Which of these answer choices sounds like that? Let's look at A. The literary arts are seductive but ultimately dangerous for women. This is an extreme wrong answer trap. Ultimately dangerous for women, also just really kind of out there. Nowhere did she talk about the literary arts. But you might think dangerous for women, there was some stuff about wife beating, but too out there to be the right answer. Okay. B. Women were trapped by patriarchy, much as an insect caught by a predator. This is kind of like a half right, half wrong sort of thing. Women were trapped, and you think, yeah, I saw that, and they were trapped. But that's not what this metaphor is talking about. Much as an insect caught by a predator. Wrong metaphor. So this can't be the right answer. What about C? The creation of literature is dependent on the realities of writers' lives. This sounds better, right? It's this idea that fiction isn't in a vacuum. It exists in a context. And a lot of the writing has to do with the lives and their money and their health and things like that. Sounds good. Let's just check D. Unlike fiction, science can be conducted by either men or women. Totally out there. Maybe science, the word science showed up once, not important. Okay, great. We can choose D. Sorry, we can choose C. Let's move on. The author points out that the year 1470 was soon after Chaucer's time in order to. We kind of picked this up with an I wonder statement as we were reading the passage. We thought, why is she telling us this, if you remember? Let's look at the passage. Here we go. That was about 1470, soon after Chaucer's time. And we thought, why is she telling us this? The next reference to the position of women is some 200 years later, in the time of the Stuarts. So if you think, why is she telling me this? Probably just to give you the context, the historical context when it was happening, because then she goes on to 200 years later. So which answer choice most sounds like that? We can look at A, indict Chaucer for causing the conditions 15th century women faced. Really extreme and also totally out there. B, provide a meaningful chronological point of reference for her well-read audience. That sounds pretty good. She's saying, this is when that happened. This is when Chaucer was around. Let's hold on with B, and we'll try C and D. C, correct the misconception that Chaucer was a 17th century woman. Crazy. Okay, totally out there. D, applaud Chaucer for contradicting the accepted gender stereotypes of his time. Another totally out there. Okay, perfect. So we know the answer choice is B, provide a meaningful chronological point of reference. Great. Let's go to the next one. Which of the following examples of a historian's work, if true, would most undermine the author's characterization of their profession? This is interesting. We picked this up when we were talking about contrasts. If we look at the passage, she was talking about historians, and there was a part where she said to ask the historian who records not opinions, but facts. So this idea that a historian is someone who's just really, really factual. There's not opinion thrown in and not bias. Okay, let's look at the question. Which of the following would most undermine that characterization? So most undermine this idea that historians write factual work. Well, A, a biography produced on behalf of a presidential candidate's campaign. Let's think about a biography. It's not very neutral if it's produced for a presidential candidate's campaign, right? So that would kind of go against what she said about historians being only factual. Let's check B, C, and D just in case. B, an analysis of ballot returns in a Senate race. Kind of factual, no bias vibe here. Let's cross that off. C, a study of the monetary cost of armaments in World War I. Again, that could be pretty factual, and remember, we're looking for the opposite of what a historian is. So we're looking for something that has a biased opinion kind of vibe to it. D, an examination of meteorological trends in the Middle Ages. Again, an examination, pretty factual. We're looking for the opposite. We can cross that off. So we see the answer choice is in fact A. If a historian wrote a biography on behalf of a campaign, that would be biased, which would be exactly undermining the author's characterization of a historian's profession. All right, onward. Number 5. As it is used in line 41, the word wanting most nearly means. Remember, vocab and context, right? You've got a word. In context of the passage, what's it talking about? Okay, by the way, you guys, when you see a vocab in context, the synonym for the word is usually wrong. So you're looking for a word that isn't the typical meaning of the passage. So already just by looking through the answer choices, desiring, that's really, when you think want, you think I desire. I would even cross that off. It's not going to be the right answer. Let's head to the passage and talk about in context what the word wanting means. And it's great that they tell us it's in line 41. Okay, line 41. Here we go. And I'll read a little bit in front just to give us context. Neither Shakespeare's women nor those of authentic 17th century memoirs like the Verneys and the Hutchinsons seem wanting in personality and character. So what does wanting mean there? Probably something like missing, right? The whole point was they're not missing personality. They've got oomph, these characters. Okay, so which sounds most like that? Well, hungry, definitely not. Indifferent, not really. Lacking is perfect. None of these characters were lacking personality. Great. That's your one vocab in context. Question 6. According to the passage, so a detailed question, straight in the passage, the portrayal of women in fiction differs from their historical position in that what? So we see, according to the passage, we know it's a detailed question, not much thinking, right? This was straight in the passage. Okay, well, what did the passage say? She said women in fiction look really powerful, really interesting. Women in real life, they were really beaten, thrown around, didn't have a lot of rights. Which answer choice sounds most like that? Let's look at A. Real women did not conform to the subservient stereotypes illustrated by fiction. We know in fiction they weren't subservient. So this is half right, half wrong. B. Literature never took account of the tragedy or violence in women's lives. You see this word never? That's extreme. And also this is a little out there. Not the answer we're looking for. C. Fictional women often had a heroic freedom of action that real ones lacked. This sounds good. In fiction, all these women had a lot of freedom to act, had a lot of rights. In real life, not so much. This sounds great, but let's just check D. Real women were not as physically attractive as characters like Rosalind. Totally out there. You see her name, and it's going to look familiar to you, misused detail, but otherwise, this is not the answer to this question. Great. So we can circle C. Onward. Number 7. Professor Trevelyan's phrase, so far at least as law and custom could make him, implies that what? And we did pick this up when we were reading. We said, that's kind of an interesting qualifying phrase. He doesn't sound so confident about this. Why? Why would he use a phrase like that? Let's take a look and you'll see what I mean. Let's find it. Here we go at the end. It was still the exception for women of the upper and middle class to choose their own husbands, and when the husband had been assigned, he was lord and master, so far at least as law and custom could make him. So it almost sounds like, yeah, the guys are in charge, but that's what the law and the customs say. And it almost sounds like there were maybe times when that wasn't the case. Okay, back to the question. So what does it imply? This is an inference. Is it A, marriages in the 17th century were not recognized by law? Totally out there, right? And we said even legally there was stuff going on, so there were legal things involved with marriages. We can cross that off. B, women were the sole legal authorities in households, also totally out there. C, regardless of legal technicality, in practice, a husband did not always maintain total dominance. That sounds good. That explains that qualifier there, at least as far as law and custom could make him, right? Which shows it wasn't always like that. C sounds great. Let's just check D to make sure. D, husbands had to receive special notarized permission for wife beating. Totally out there. You've got your misused detail, but that's it. So D is off, and the answer is C. Great. Let's keep going. 8. The passage states that historically, marriage was largely what? Again, straight from the passage. So let's take a look. What did they say about marriage? Well, this is something we did underline. Marriage was not an affair of personal affection, so this was a contrast. Instead, it was about family avarice or greed, family just wanting money. Okay, which of these sounds like that? Is it A, a rebellious act of youthful abandon? Definitely not. These women do not sound like they were able to have rebellious, youthful stuff going on. B, based on personal affection. This is the opposite, actually, right? We know that wasn't the case. What about C, a financial arrangement between the parties' families? This sounds better because it was talking about the family's greed. Let's just check D. An illicit ceremony performed by historians. We've got this misused detail about the historians, but this is wrong. Answer choice is C. Okay, number 9. Phaedra, Cressida, and Rosalind are cited as examples of women portrayed by famous what? So again, let's look back at the passage and just figure out which one that is. So we've got a whole list here with Phaedra, Cressida, Rosalind, Desdemona, among the dramatists. Okay, so these are characters that the dramatists used. Powerful women. All right, and we see that B would be the one here. So this is just straight from the passage. Last, author's feelings about the results of her research would most likely be described as what? Remember, we picked this up so many times when we read the passage. What's the author's vibe? Is she really invested? And we said she really was. And if you'll remember, right at the beginning, we underlined disappointing because she was really just disappointed that she wasn't getting the answers that she wanted. And then she headed back and did the research. So she's really, really disappointed. But also we knew she did the research again. There was some reference to her going back again and looking. Okay. So which of these sounds most like the author's feelings? We know we're looking for something like she's really bummed, but she also just seems really invested. She's going to keep going. Okay, A, sanguine and optimistic. She's definitely not optimistic. She's disappointed. So we can cross off A. B, defeated but apathetic. Apathetic implies she doesn't care. And we know she does. She cares a lot. What about C, disappointed but unbowed? Unbowed meaning not wanting to give up. Disappointed sounds great, and actually, that's even the word straight from the passage. So let's keep that, and we'll just check D. Caustic and sarcastic. Definitely not. There's no sarcasm in this passage at all. So we can circle C. That's great. We just did all 10 questions attached to our passage. Just to recap, in this episode, we talked about different question types that you'll always see on the ACT and how they show up consistently. Remember, there are 6 of those. We talked about how to spot common wrong answer traps so you don't choose them on the ACT. And last, we practiced on a real passage. And remember, the key to your success on the ACT is practice, practice, practice on your own passages.